Hey guys, today I'll show you a fantasy thriller TV series named The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with a legend saying that long ago, in the ancient world of Middle-earth, there was no evil, no darkness, and the entire land was bathed in eternal light. That was until one day, the Dark Lord Morgoth descended upon the world with his monstrous army. He not only destroyed the source of light for the elves, but also plunged the world into an abyss of endless darkness and slaughter. The elves, determined to save their homeland, gathered the strength of their entire race and marched to the Central Plains to confront Morgoth's forces. The war raged on for centuries, its brutality beyond anyone's imagination. The Central Plains became a wasteland, littered with corpses, echoing with countless songs of sorrow. At last, Morgoth's demonic army was defeated, but his remnants fled to various parts of the Central Plains. Among them, the most powerful and cunning was the evil sorcerer Sauron. The elves never ceased hunting him down. Galadriel's brother was slain by Sauron and left with a strange mark on his body. Swearing to honor her brother's legacy, the elven princess Galadriel vowed to hunt Sauron to the ends of the earth. Yet years turned to decades, and nearly a century passed. Sauron's traces grew ever more elusive. Time made many elves forget their pain, and some even believed Sauron had vanished for good, that the threat of the monstrous horde was over. But Galadriel never gave up. She led her warriors through mountains and valleys, scouring every corner of the world. Despite her relentless efforts, Sauron's trail remained cold, and even her soldiers began to think it was a futile pursuit. Nevertheless, Galadriel insisted they press on. The bitter wind howled, making each step an ordeal. Lightning streaked across the darkened skies, briefly illuminating a grand palace in the distance. It seemed likely this was a gathering place for the remnants of Morgoth's forces. Everyone quickened their pace, and before long they reached the palace's interior. The air was thick with malevolent energy, so oppressive that even their torches emitted no warmth. Galadriel sharpened her focus and led her team deeper into the palace. But despite scouring every corner of the grand hall, they found no sign of an enemy. Before long, she noticed something peculiar about one of the walls. Tentatively, she struck it with her fist, revealing a hidden doorway. To their surprise, the secret room was vast, its walls lined with ritual artifacts. Galadriel suspected the place had been used by Sauron for some dark sorcery. As she spoke, a snowflake fell onto the stone floor. Galadriel noticed it immediately, pulling out a flask of water and pouring it over the spot. Instantly, a clear imprint of a demonic hand emerged, identical to the strange mark left on her brother. This was undeniable proof that the evil sorcerer Sauron had once been here. Galadriel's spirit reignited as she deduced the mark was a signal left for his followers. She instructed the team to rest early, for they would resume their journey north at dawn. Her lieutenant, however, was less optimistic. He argued that the mark was centuries old and that Sauron might already be dead like a piece of shit. But Galadriel dismissed the idea outright, convinced that Sauron was in hiding, amassing his strength. The lieutenant protested further, pointing out that their actions had already exceeded their orders and that they needed to return home to consult the High King. Yet Galadriel stubbornly refused to leave without finding Sauron. Just then, one of her scouts, exploring a side chamber, heard movement in the darkness. Approaching cautiously, he was met with a terrifying creature. Frozen in horror, he turned and fled like a chicken toward the main hall, his cries of alarm echoing through the palace. It turned out to be a hulking creature, immensely strong, with a single swing of its arm sending elven warriors tumbling across the ground, with chills running down their spines to their smelly butts. This was the fabled snow troll. Yet Galadriel remained unfazed. With her lieutenant's assistance, she leaped gracefully into the air, lunging toward the beast. Using her agility, she struck repeatedly, landing blow after blow until a final thrust to its heart finally rendered the creature lifeless. Although her victory was flawless, the elven warriors grew increasingly weary of this arduous journey. Her lieutenant was the first to demand they return to the elven city, and the others soon echoed his sentiment. Galadriel, realizing she could not continue alone, reluctantly chose to compromise. They would first return to Lindon, the High Elves' central stronghold. The son of the High King, Elrond, had been a longtime friend of Galadriel. Hearing of her arrival, he couldn't contain his excitement, but his joy quickly turned to disappointment when he realized she hadn't come for a hormone reunion. Instead, she sought the High King's permission to assemble another battalion and resume her search for Sauron. Elrond could only smile wryly, unable to understand why she still cared about Sauron in this age of peace. The following morning, the High King summoned all returning elven warriors. With great formality, he declared the era of war over and a new age of peace upon them. The High King expressed his gratitude for Galadriel's years of service, granting her and her soldiers the elves' highest honor, eternal residency in the sacred lands. This is a dream cherished by many. However, Galadriel was reluctant. Deep down, she was certain Sauron had not vanished, but she dared not reject the High King's goodwill in front of everyone. That night, as all the elves celebrated, the Princess Galadriel quietly visited her brother's statue. She had never forgotten his dying wish. Elrond approached her, urging her to let go of the past, saying that evil had been vanquished, and one symbol alone couldn't refute this truth. He suggested Galadriel should journey to the sacred lands to heal her broken heart. He promised that if there were ever any sign of lingering evil, he would pursue it without hesitation. His words eventually persuaded Galadriel. Reluctantly, she agreed to abandon her hunt for Sauron and follow the others to the sacred lands. Still, doubts lingered in her mind. She kept wondering if a force as powerful as Sauron's could truly be eradicated. Unbeknownst to her, the remnants of Morgoth's monstrous forces had already infiltrated every corner of the world. Far away in the vast fields of Rhovanion, two travelers with thick horn-like growths on their backs trekked across the endless plains. Known for their years of wanderlust, they prided themselves on their vast knowledge of the world. That day, they passed through the territory of the Harfoot clan, but no traces of life could be found. As they moved further away, small figures began to emerge from what seemed like ordinary grasslands. Soon, countless camouflaged forms shed their disguises, and the Harfoot village revealed itself. These people had long lived a reclusive, conflict-free existence, avoiding interactions with other races. However, one exception stood out: a curious Harfoot girl named Nori, who had always yearned to explore the outside world. That day, she led a group of children into the clan's designated danger zone. Though fraught with peril, the area was teeming with delicious fruits. While gathering the bounty, one child stumbled upon a demonic handprint hidden in the grass. Not knowing what it was, Nori immediately ushered everyone away. Her caution proved wise, for the danger was all too real. At the far edge of the continent lay the lands of the human realm, mostly comprised of small villages. Due to certain peculiar reasons, all their security forces were staffed by elves. Recently, however, strange occurrences had plagued the villages. Livestock feed was mysteriously rotting, and people fell ill after drinking from the wells. Arondir, the elf assigned to investigate, tried to uncover more clues, but the villagers were deeply distrustful of elves and refused to share any information. Arondir felt powerless, especially since the High King's declaration that the war was over had reached even these remote lands. With it came the decision to withdraw the elves, ending their 79-year-long station in the region and returning them to the lands of the Elven Kingdom. But before leaving, Arondir wanted to bid farewell to the woman he had secretly admired for years. She was the village's only healer, kind, courageous, and dependable. Just as the two were about to have a moment, an old cowman rushed over, pleading for help because his cow had contracted a strange illness, and the healer suspected it might have eaten something poisonous. Arondir examined the cow and with some effort managed to extract a black liquid from it. This wasn't ordinary poisoning. It was likely connected to the dark forces. After questioning the cowman about where the cow had grazed, Arondir set off to investigate. Meanwhile, the healer's young son stumbled upon a peculiar staff beneath the floorboards of an abandoned hut. The staff glowed faintly, casting an ominous demonic handprint on the wall. Elsewhere, Arondir and the healer followed their leads, eventually spotting thick smoke rising from behind a hill. When they approached, they found an entire village burned to ashes. There was no doubt it was the work of the dark forces. At the same time, the eldest sage of the Harfoot clan gazed at the sky with unease. The moon and stars appeared simultaneously, as if watching over them. Before long, a massive fireball streaked down from the heavens, trailing flames that tore through the sky. Everyone looked up in bewilderment. Galadriel also saw a radiant light, but it wasn't the fireball. It was the entrance to the elves' sacred highlands. She and a group of newly trained warriors were aboard a ship, shedding their armor in preparation for their arrival at this fabled sanctuary. As they neared their destination, the warriors sang songs of joy, but Galadriel remained unmoved. The light ahead grew brighter, slicing through the dense fog over the sea like a blade. The entrance to the sacred lands was now in sight. Overcome with anticipation, the elven warriors surged forward, but Galadriel hesitated. She recalled her brother's teachings from their youth. What appears to be light may not always be true light. Only by confronting darkness can one discover the truth. Her resolve hardened. With a sudden leap, she dove into the sea, abandoning her chance to enter the sacred lands. She had decided to continue her search for the darkness and to welcome the moment of true light. As if to confirm Galadriel's instincts, the High King, who had been observing the strange fireball, picked up a leaf that had drifted down beside him. He turned it over and was startled to see it absorbing dark energy. Meanwhile, Nori of the Harfoot clan witnessed the fireball's descent into the crater, and her curiosity was piqued. She then approached the crash site of the fireball, which had landed not far away. At its center was a massive crater, and lying unconscious at the bottom was a human. As she stepped closer, she lost her footing and tumbled into the pit. To her surprise, the blazing flames emitted no heat, deepening her intrigue about the stranger's identity. Suddenly, the man regained consciousness and grabbed Nori's arm. A swirling gust of wind erupted around him, seemingly drawing the surrounding flames into its vortex. Moments later, the man collapsed again, and everything returned to its original state. Compassionate as ever, Nori couldn't bring herself to leave him there, knowing he'd likely fall prey to wolves. With the help of her companions, she loaded him onto a cart and carefully navigated the hill until they reached a tent at the village's edge, a place less frequented by wolves, where they decided he could rest for the night. At dawn, Nori eagerly returned to check on the man, only to find him crouched on the ground, drawing strange symbols. She approached to greet him, but he suddenly became agitated. Nori quickly reminded him she saved him last night. Slowly, the man seemed to calm down, as if piecing together fragments of his memory. Nori had brought plenty of food for him, though it was clear he'd forgotten even the most basic skills, struggling with something as simple as eating. Yet Nori showed no impatience, staying by his side as he continued sketching the enigmatic symbols. Just then, one of her companions came rushing over, out of breath, to tell Nori that her father had been injured. It turned out that, after witnessing a series of strange celestial events the day before, the Harfoot clan's sage had deemed them an ominous sign. He suggested the clan relocate to a safer area. While dismantling their home, Nori's father had suffered an accident. When she arrived, she found him sitting motionless on the bed, his swollen ankle looking like a loaf of hamburger. Villagers whispered among themselves, debating how to move an injured man during the migration. Though worried for her father, Nori didn't forget to bid farewell to the stranger. She found him unusually fixated on the fireflies in a lantern, almost as if he could communicate with them. As he softly murmured a few words, the fireflies floated into the air, forming constellations that sparkled like stars. Nori, with a touch of innocence, offered to help the man find these stars, but her companion suddenly noticed something terrifying. The fireflies were mysteriously dying mid-flight. Nori was also stunned, wondering just who this man was. Elsewhere, Arondir, the elven guardian in the human realm, stumbled upon a burned-out village. Suspecting it to be the work of dark forces, he rushed to investigate. Sure enough, the destruction bore signs of deliberate sabotage, yet no bodies were to be found. In the ruins of a wooden house, he discovered a tunnel entrance that could not have been dug by humans. What's more, it seemed to lead directly to the healer's village. Uneasy, Arondir quickly instructed the healer to warn the villagers while he himself descended into the tunnel, determined to uncover the truth. The healer didn't hesitate. She ran to the village tavern and announced that the neighboring village had been attacked. However, the villagers dismissed her concerns. They had long awaited the elves' withdrawal and weren't about to invite them back now. Realizing she couldn't convince them, the healer decided to return home to fetch her son and leave as soon as possible. By this time, Arondir had crawled deep into the tunnel. On the stone walls, he noticed claw marks and even a fragment of a fingernail embedded in the rock, confirming his suspicion that this was the work of the dark forces. Just then, he sensed a shadow closing in from behind. Panicking, Arondir scrambled forward, only to find himself at the edge of an underground pool. Fighting his rising fear, he swam to the other side and climbed onto the rocky shore. Drawing his dagger, he stared intently at the water's surface. Suddenly, several black hands reached out from behind him. The scene shifts to the healer returning home in a rush, only to find her house in complete disarray. Her heart sank. She feared the worst for her son. But then, to her immense relief, she discovered him hiding unscathed inside a cupboard. Her relief was short-lived, as noises began emanating from the tunnel. With no time to lose, the healer joined her son in hiding. Just as they shut the wooden door, a terrifying figure crawled out of the tunnel. It was a soldier of the dark forces, as described in the legends. Terrified, the healer held her breath, silently praying the creature would leave without sensing her smell. But fate had other plans. The soldier yanked the cupboard door open. At that critical moment, the boy leapt out to protect his mother. The healer threw a powdery concoction at the creature and plunged her dagger into it. Using the distraction, the boy managed to loop a rope around the creature, suspending it mid-air. However, the monster quickly broke free, and as it turned its rage toward her son, the healer erupted with a surge of adrenaline, slaying the creature with a final blow. The severed head of the dark soldier convinced the rest of the villagers that it was time to leave and seek the elves' protection. Yet the healer couldn't be sure they would make it safely, as the dark forces could appear at any moment. Meanwhile, Galadriel's fears had come true. Her decision to forsake the sacred elven lands to pursue the dark forces was not in vain. Alone, she plunged into the vast ocean in her quest, but she had vastly underestimated its immensity. Exhausted and nearing her limit, she had yet to see any sign of land. Just as she was about to succumb, she came across a floating raft. Dragging herself aboard, she was met with hostility from its occupants. When they noticed her pointed ears, a defining elven feature, they even tried to push her heavy body back into the sea. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed in the distance. Someone recognized it as their ship, though it was closely followed by a giant sea monster. The creature had attacked their ship earlier, forcing them to abandon it. Now it was closing in once more. Sensing danger, Galadriel took the opportunity to dive back into the water and swim far away. Hours passed and the chaos faded into silence. She assumed the others hadn't survived. Not long after, a human paddled over to her on a broken Tesla raft, powered by manpower rather than battery. As it turned out, he had cleverly untied a raft when the sea monster first appeared, allowing him to escape the carnage. With no other choice, Galadriel joined him on the Tesla manual raft. Being an elf, she initially ignored him, but when the man named Halbrand revealed that his human homeland had been destroyed by the dark forces, Galadriel's demeanor changed immediately. Excited, she demanded he take her to his village. Halbrand, however, refused outright, unwilling to return to a place of certain death. Frustrated, Galadriel trembled with anger, secretly wishing a storm could send this Tesla driver away to drive in hell for Satan. That night, her wish came true. A massive storm rolled in, and the Tesla raft was tossed about like a leaf in the wind. Halbrand was thrown into the sea by a giant wave, and Galadriel, abandoning her grudge, helped tie him to herself with a rope. Moments later, a bolt of lightning struck, sending Galadriel plunging into the water to wet herself. To make matters worse, she became entangled with an anchor, dragging her rapidly toward the ocean floor. Halbrand hesitated for a moment before leaping in after her. He swam to her side, cutting through the ropes to free her, and managed to bring her heavy body back to the surface. Thanks to his efforts, Galadriel survived, and the incident dissolved the tension between them. As luck would have it, they soon encountered a Titanic ship, bringing their ordeal to an end. While Galadriel was risking her life in a battle against the dark forces, the Elven Kingdom was preoccupied with artistic pursuits. The High King had summoned the kingdom's most renowned master craftsman to collaborate with his son, Elrond, on creating a masterpiece that would elevate their influence. The master craftsman envisioned a project on par with the legendary Hammer of the Elves. His grand design was a forge tower capable of tempering immensely powerful weapons. Elrond quickly realized the key issue. Such a project would require a skilled workforce, necessitating collaboration with outsiders. Both he and the master craftsman concluded that their best potential partners were the dwarves, known for their mastery in forging. Without delay, they traveled to the dwarven capital, a city nestled amidst towering mountain ranges. Elrond was no stranger to the place. He and Prince Durin of the dwarves had been friends for decades. Confident he could win Durin's support, Elrond was taken aback when he was immediately turned away at the gates. Refusing to leave empty-handed, Elrond played his trump card, requesting to participate in the ancient Durin clan ritual. This bold move proved effective. Before long, the massive gates creaked open, and Elrond was escorted inside by a group of guards. From the outside, the dwarven city appeared unremarkable, but its interior was a marvel to behold, majestic and grand beyond imagination. Awestruck, Elrond followed the guards to the gathering hall, where Prince Durin soon entered, surrounded by his retinue. However, Durin paid no attention to his elven friend, instead showing keen interest in the upcoming ritual. The Durin clan ritual was an ancient dwarven tradition, a contest of endurance and strength. Participants took turns striking a massive stone with an axe until one of them could strike no more. The loser would be forever banished from dwarven lands. Durin began the challenge with a mighty swing of his axe, and the competition unfolded amid the cheering of the crowd. It was a grueling test of power and stamina as the stone was chipped away bit by bit until one contestant finally admitted defeat. Unsurprisingly, Elrond lost the match, exhausted and overpowered. As per the rules, he was to be exiled from the Dwarven Kingdom. Before leaving, Elrond managed to secure a private moment with Prince Durin to clear the air. It turned out Durin had been harboring a grudge. Elrond hadn't visited him for 20 years and had even missed his wedding. For an elf, 20 years was a blink of an eye, but for a dwarf with a comparatively short lifespan, it was an unforgivable slight. Realizing his mistake, Elrond offered a heartfelt apology and insisted on personally apologizing to Durin's wife as well. The dwarves eventually relented. Durin not only forgave Elrond but also invited him to his home for dinner. Elrond's diplomatic skills shone through during the meal. He reminisced about old times, shared his struggles, and managed to completely dissolve Durin's resentment. By the end of the evening, Durin promised to present Elrond's proposal to the Dwarven King. Elrond lit up with a sly smile. The scene shifted to Durin's father, the Dwarven King, nervously unlocking a treasure chest. Judging by his anxious expression, it seemed the chest contained a sacred elven artifact. Previously, the elven guardian Arondir was searching for orcs, the servants of Morgoth, in a tunnel when he fell into a trap and was captured by a suddenly appearing group of orcs. When he woke up again, he found himself taken to one of their lairs. Surrounding him were numerous ragged laborers, among whom were even 2 of his fellow elven warriors. They were being forced to dig through the earth, seemingly in search of something. The orcs oversaw the operation from the shadows of makeshift tents, as exposure to sunlight would weaken them. Many of the orcs wore masks to protect themselves. The former elven chieftain had been held captive for a long time, long enough to learn that the orcs revered their new leader, J.R.R, as if he were Morgoth's successor. This was critical intelligence that needed to reach the Elven Kingdom without delay. The prisoners agreed to stage an escape at noon during the peak sunlight hours, believing that even a single successful escape would mark a victory. Just as they were making their plans, a commotion arose among the captives. A massive ancient tree had blocked the excavation path. The orc leader ordered the tree cut down, but the nature-loving elves adamantly refused. The argument escalated until one of the orcs killed an elven prisoner in cold blood. Arondir clenched his fists, swallowing his anger and humiliation, and silently prayed for the sunlight to arrive quickly. By the following noon, the sky was bright, and the time had come to act. The elven chieftain launched the first attack, creating a diversion while the other captives frantically hacked at the chains on their feet. The orcs reacted swiftly, sending reinforcements to the tents to drag back the captives. Seizing an opportunity, Arondir leapt forward and destroyed the sunshade, exposing all the orcs to the blazing sunlight. They recoiled into the shadows, but they had a backup plan, a dire wolf that was impervious to sunlight. This savage beast tore through several humans in an instant. Fortunately, the elven chieftain managed to break free and began climbing the slope to safety, the dire wolf hot on his heels. Arondir, still in the fray below, hurled a spear with precision, killing the direwolf trailing behind the chieftain. He thought the chieftain had finally made it to freedom, only to discover moments later that the chieftain had been struck down by an orc's arrow. The entire forest was overrun with orcs. Just as Arondir braced for the fatal blow, an authoritative voice ordered the orcs to stop. The speaker was none other than Adar, the orcs' enigmatic new leader, visible only as a shadowy figure in the distance. While Arondir faced Adar, Galadriel was still relentlessly pursuing traces of the orcs. She and the Tesla driver, Halbrand, had recently survived a violent sea storm, only to be rescued by a passing Titanic. However, upon awakening, Galadriel sensed something was amiss. The ship crew had recognized her as an elf and treated her with open hostility. The ship captain, Elendil, confiscated her weapon and announced that she would be taken to their superiors for judgment. At first, Galadriel had no idea who these people were, but as the ship approached a massive harbor, her keen intellect quickly pieced it together. This was Numenor, the most advanced human civilization. Located on the westernmost edge of the world, Numenor was a breathtaking city of grand architecture that inspired awe and reverence. Its people had once fought alongside the elves to defeat Morgoth, and as a reward, the Valor God had gifted them this island. In the beginning, humans and elves maintained a friendly relationship. However, as time passed, Morgoth's lingering influence planted fear of mortality in the hearts of humans, a fear the immortal elves did not share. Distrust and jealousy festered, and relations between the two races began to deteriorate until they eventually severed all ties. Under Captain Elendil's guidance, Galadriel soon met the ruler of the city, the Queen Regent. Galadriel, holding disdain for what she saw as treacherous allies, bluntly introduced herself and demanded a ship to return to Middle-earth. However, the Queen, harboring her own dislike for elves, declared that the ship would come at the cost of diabetic blood. The tension escalated immediately, but Halbrand quickly diffused the situation, suggesting they stay for 3 days to allow both sides to reconsider. Halbrand had his reasons for staying. Coming from a fallen noble family, he had grown up learning how to navigate the shadows with charm and cunning. Upon parting ways with Captain Elendil, he even managed to pocket Galadriel's sword, a treasured relic of her brother, which left Galadriel both furious and begrudgingly grateful. Unlike Galadriel, Halbrand had no intention of leaving. His human homeland was already gone, and he saw an opportunity to establish himself in the city. His first stop was a blacksmith shop where he sought work, only to be harshly rejected because employment required a guild badge. But for someone as resourceful as Halbrand, this was no obstacle. Arriving at a tavern, he boldly declared that drinks were on him. The gesture instantly won over the locals, allowing him to blend in and swipe a guild badge in the process. What Halbrand didn't anticipate was that the badge's owner wasn't someone to trifle with. Upon discovering the theft, the owner and his friends quickly came looking for trouble. Not wanting to escalate the situation, Halbrand returned the badge, but they continued pressing him. With no other choice, Halbrand fought back, effortlessly subduing the group despite their reputation for strength. Unfortunately, the brawl caught the attention of the city guards, and Halbrand was promptly arrested, ironically achieving his goal of becoming a permanent fixture in the city. In stark contrast, Galadriel wanted nothing more than to leave. She attempted to sneak out of her room to commandeer a ship, only to be caught by Captain Elendil. The Queen Regent, having anticipated Galadriel's escape, had specifically instructed the captain to guard her. His name, which meant elf friend in ancient Elvish, left the Queen somewhat wary of his allegiance, so she assigned him this task as a test of loyalty. Frustrated, Galadriel abandoned her plan but quickly found an unexpected ally in Captain Elendil. Fluent in Elvish and an admirer of Elven culture, he revealed that the libraries in his homeland taught Elvish as a formal subject. The mention of a library piqued Galadriel's interest, and she immediately insisted on visiting. Before long, the two were galloping across the plains toward their destination. After half a day's journey, Galadriel finally reached the library. Her first action was to sketch the sorcerer Sauron's sigil and present it to the librarian for analysis. The library, built by Elrond's brother and steeped in history, housed an enormous collection of books. The librarian quickly returned with the findings. The sigil bore a striking resemblance to a mark used by a human spy. Galadriel's realization hit her like a thunderbolt. The sigil wasn't just a mark. It outlined the southern lands of Middle-earth. The accompanying text, written in the dark tongue of Sauron, revealed a chilling plan. It turns out, after Morgoth's defeat, the Dark Forces intended to establish a new stronghold in the south, a haven where their dark power could be reborn. Galadriel broke out in a cold sweat. She realized Sauron hadn't been hiding out of fear. He was biding his time, carefully plotting his return to plunge the world into darkness once more. After locating Halbrand in the prison, Galadriel revealed something she had uncovered in the library, the crest of Halbrand's family. It turns out Halbrand was no ordinary vagabond, but the rightful heir to the southern lands of Middle-earth. His ancestors had once united the southern lands under a single banner, only to ally themselves with Morgoth. When Morgoth was defeated, their territories were fractured and scattered. Realizing these, Galadriel urged Halbrand to reclaim his legacy, unite the South, and join forces with the elves to defeat Sauron, thereby redeeming his family's past transgressions. Meanwhile, the ever-optimistic Harfoots remained unaffected by the tragic events unfolding across Middle-earth. They were preparing to migrate once again, moving to a new haven to continue their carefree existence. However, Nori's family faced a significant problem. Her father had injured his leg, which would undoubtedly slow their progress and potentially cause them to fall behind. Her mother was already beside herself with worry, but Nori seemed unconcerned, her attention fixated on the stranger they had encountered previously. While her family fretted over the migration, Nori snuck into the sage's study, determined to uncover the truth about the constellation the stranger had marked using fireflies. She rifled through his journals, searching for any clue. Just as she made progress, the sage unexpectedly returned, forcing Nori to hide under the table. Thanks to her clever friend distracting him, Nori managed to escape with an illustration of the constellation. The following day, as the entire Harfoot clan gathered for their customary remembrance of those who had died during past migrations, the atmosphere was solemn. Suddenly, the stranger appeared uninvited. Without hesitation, he opened Nori's bag and pulled out the constellation sketch, his brows furrowed as he studied it under the firelight. So engrossed was he that he didn't notice the paper catching fire in the flames. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late, and in his panic, he caused a commotion that drew everyone's attention. The Harfoots were terrified of the towering stranger and shrank back in fear. It wasn't until he called Nori's name that they understood he meant no harm. Nori's decision to bring an outsider to their sacred grounds naturally earned her a harsh scolding. By Harfoot law, she should have been exiled from the clan for such a transgression. However, given her youth, the sage showed leniency, merely relegating Nori and her family to the back of the migration line. The stranger, silently observing, seemed to grasp the trouble he had caused Nori's family. The next morning, as Nori's family lagged further behind the main group, the stranger appeared behind their cart. Offering to help them catch up with the others, he tied himself to their fate. From that moment on, Nori and the enigmatic stranger were bound together, embarking on an adventure that would change their lives forever. The scene shifts to Arondir being executed after a failed escape attempt. The orcs' new leader, Adar, intervened and stopped the execution. For the first time, Arondir saw Adar's face, and unlike the grotesque appearances of the orcs, Adar had the striking features of a handsome man. Kneeling next to an injured orc, Adar smiled, but mercilessly ended the creature's life with his own hands. It was a textbook display of cruelty and silence. When Adar turned to Arondir, he unexpectedly asked where the elf was from. Arondir answered, "It's Beleriand, a land that had sunk beneath the sea after the War of Wrath." Adar, who seemed deeply familiar with the place, spoke fondly of its past beauty. Perhaps moved by old memories, Adar chose to release Arondir and tasked him with delivering a message to the humans in the region. Meanwhile, the elven watchtower where Arondir was stationed had become overcrowded with human refugees fleeing the orcs, leading to a dire shortage of food. The healer suggested hunting for supplies, but her son Theo, ignoring her advice, secretly returned to their village with a friend during the daylight hours to scavenge. Armed with a broken sword he had recently found, Theo had begun to feel emboldened by its mysterious power. At a tavern in the village, Theo insisted on searching for supplies, despite his companion's visible terror. His friend fled with their gathered provisions, leaving Theo to face danger alone. Sure enough, orcs ambushed Theo. Using the sword's dark magic, he managed to escape temporarily and hid inside a well. To his horror, the orcs seemed to recognize the sword and began an exhaustive search for him. It turned out the sword was a critical artifact Adar had been desperately seeking, prompting the orcs to scour the region and even dig through the ground. Theo remained hidden in the well until nightfall, when the orcs' vigilance waned. Just as he thought he could escape, he was spotted by one of the creatures. At the last moment, a blade pierced through the orc. It was Arondir, who wasted no words before grabbing Theo and fleeing for their shitty lives. The two sprinted through the forest with orcs relentlessly pursuing them. Arondir's exceptional archery skills shone through as he shot arrows while running, using hit-and-run tactics to slow their pursuers. Along the way, they encountered Theo's mother, and the three managed to escape the forest. However, Theo, exhausted from the chase, could run no further. The group drew their weapons, preparing for a desperate last stand. just as it seemed they would have to sacrifice everything for survival. The clouds parted, and brilliant sunlight flooded the plains. Terrified of the light, the orcs retreated to the shadows, roaring in frustration as they watched the three humans escape. Arondir and the healer soon reached the elven watchtower. Having survived life and death trials together, their bond grew even stronger. However, Arondir remained troubled by the message he was tasked to deliver by Adar. If the humans at the watchtower wished to save their lives, they would have to abandon their land and swear loyalty to Adar. Back in the village, the tavern keeper confronted Theo, revealing himself as the previous owner of the broken sword. He explained that anyone who wielded the blade would bear its mark on their arm. The sword was forged by sorcerer Sauron himself and gifted to his servants, ancestors of the current refugees. The massive fireball that recently appeared in the sky was a signal heralding the Dark Lord's return. It seemed these humans were fated to repeat their forebears' mistakes, joining Sauron to wreak havoc upon the world. Not far away, Adar received reports from his orcs confirming that the sword was now at the Elven Watchtower. A bloody battle loomed on the horizon, destined to mark Sauron's re-emergence and his first war upon his return. Meanwhile, on the westernmost edge of the world, the white tree's leaves trembled violently in Numenor, a sign of impending doom. The vision of Numenor's catastrophic downfall left Queen Regent gripped by fear. At the same time, Galadriel, the elven princess, unwittingly confronted the queen, attempting to convince her to ally with the elves, raise an army, and march against Sauron to save the southern lands of Middle-earth. Galadriel warned that if Sauron's power continued to grow unchecked, Numenor itself would inevitably face destruction. However, the Queen Regent, well aware of her people's deep-seated resentment toward the elves, believed the ominous vision was caused by Galadriel's presence and promptly rejected her proposal. Galadriel, frustrated and cornered, demanded to speak with the true king. This brazen remark enraged the queen, who had Galadriel imprisoned in the dungeon, where she found herself sharing a cell with Halbrand, the fallen heir to the southern kingdom. Unlike the straightforward and inexperienced Galadriel, Halbrand was far more tactful and adept at persuasion. He remarked that convincing someone doesn't always require promises. Sometimes it's about finding their greatest fear. This simple insight struck a chord with Galadriel. The Queen Regent's deepest fear, perhaps, was her own father, the former king, since the queen imprisoned her who even mentioned him. That evening, the court's advisor descended into the dungeons with guards to escort Galadriel back to the Elven lands. Naturally, she refused to comply. In a swift and calculated move, she subdued the guards and locked them inside the cell. Under the cover of night, she stealthily climbed the tower where the old king resided. To her surprise, she found him bedridden, gravely ill, a fact the Queen Regent had carefully concealed. With her secret now exposed, the queen confessed her concerns. It's then revealed during her father's reign, his favor toward the elves had incited public outrage. The people feared the elves' immortality would rob them of their livelihoods. Ultimately, the former king was forced to abdicate, and the Queen Regent took the throne in haste. This history left her reluctant to appear overly supportive of the elves. As she explained her predicament, she led Galadriel to a mysterious crystal orb, a palantir capable of foreseeing the future. When Galadriel placed her hand on the palantir, she too saw the devastating fall of Numenor. This was the queen's true fear. She believed Galadriel's presence had triggered this looming disaster, which was why she wanted to send her away as quickly as possible. Galadriel, however, was convinced that Sauron, not her, was the true threat to Numenor. The queen ordered her deportation at dawn, unwilling to gamble her citizens' lives on Galadriel's theory. As Galadriel boarded the ship the next morning, the queen turned to leave, but caught sight of the white tree shedding its leaves in a celestial cascade. It dawned on her that Galadriel's departure did not signify the end of disaster, but perhaps the beginning. Acting swiftly, the queen recalled Galadriel and publicly announced her decision to lead an expedition to Middle-earth. She declared her intention to help the Southland's oppressed people and fight against Sauron's growing power. Her impassioned speech roused Numenor's fighting spirit, and volunteers eagerly stepped forward to join the campaign. While Numenor's army prepared for war, the elven city of a region remained eerily silent. Its inhabitants were engrossed in their collaboration with the dwarves, working to construct a colossal forge tower. However, the master craftsman suspected that the dwarves were withholding something, so he requested that Elrond return to the dwarven kingdom to uncover the truth. Upon reaching the dwarves' halls, Elrond was told that Prince Durin was away on a mining expedition and would not return for several days. Sensing something was amiss, Elrond noticed that Durin had left without any mining tools. Rather than confront the matter, he decided to discreetly follow Durin's wife. He observed her meeting Durin in secret, and by eavesdropping on their conversation, Elrond learned of the prince's actual location. Elrond approached the hidden location, only to be blocked by a massive stone wall. He recited a children's rhyme that Durin's son often sang, and to his astonishment, the wall parted, revealing the entrance to a mine. It was here that Elrond finally uncovered what the dwarves had been concealing all along, a vast treasure trove buried deep within the mountain. When Durin saw Elrond, his expression shifted dramatically, thinking that the elves were coveting dwarven treasures. Elrond hastily swore on his father's name that he would never reveal Durin's secret. Reassured by Elrond's sincerity, Durin finally shared that the dwarves had been mining a newly discovered mithril ore, the perfect material for crafting weapons. Because of its value, the ore was classified as the highest secret of the dwarves. However, Elrond seemed unimpressed by this revelation, stating that he had only come to visit an old friend. He added that even for an elf, 20 years feels like an eternity. Durin was moved by these words and, in a gesture of trust, gifted Elrond a piece of mithril to symbolize their friendship. Just then, a nearby mine tunnel collapsed. Durin wanted to rush in and rescue the trapped miners, but Elrond stopped him, ensuring his safety. Unfortunately, 4 dwarves remained trapped inside. In the following, Durin's wife began a traditional high-pitched chant, a sacred ritual to ask the rocks to protect the miners. Whether due to the ritual or sheer luck, the miners were rescued without any casualties. However, the king was furious and immediately ordered the entire mithril vein to be sealed off. Though frustrated with his father's decision, Durin was grateful to Elrond for his intervention, acknowledging that without him, Durin might have been among the trapped miners. Elrond advised Durin not to resent his father, but instead to cherish their time together. Moved by Elrond's words, Durin went to apologize to his father. The wise old king, holding no grudge, simply cautioned Durin against placing too much trust in the elves. After lying dormant for nearly a century, the orc armies raised their banners once more, launching an assault on Middle-earth under their new leader, J.R.R. The southern elven watchtower was their first target, housing a large number of human refugees seeking safety. Though J.R.R. had sent Arondir with a message urging the refugees to surrender, the proud elves refused to capitulate. With the help of the healer, Arondir began rallying the humans in the watchtower to fight back, vowing to drive the orcs out of their land. However, resistance was not unanimous. The tavern keeper publicly opposed the plan, pointing out that most of their ancestors had once served Sauron, and they had survived just fine. With a wave of his hand, he announced his intention to follow in their ancestors' footsteps and surrender to the orcs. Despite Arondir and the healer's desperate attempts to dissuade them, nearly half the refugees chose to abandon the watchtower. The healer's son Theo remained steadfast and stood by his mother's side. That evening, the defectors reached J.R.R.'s camp. The tavern keeper, acting as their leader, declared his loyalty to Sauron. But to his dismay, the figure before him was not Sauron but J.R.R. Realizing his mistake, the tavern keeper quickly changed his tune, proclaiming his loyalty to whoever the leader may be. Smiling faintly, J.R.R. ordered Theo's friend to be brought forward and instructed the tavern keeper to kill him, declaring that only blood-soaked hands could prove true allegiance. Meanwhile, the defectors were assigned to serve as the vanguard in J.R.R.'s campaign against the humans. The humans in the watchtower were actively preparing for battle. Whenever he had time, Arondir would teach Theo archery. Touched by Arondir's guidance, Theo willingly handed over a broken sword. Arondir recognized its origins. It was the same legendary weapon depicted in its entirety on the walls of the watchtower, a powerful blade coveted by the orcs for ages. At last, Arondir understood why Theo had been relentlessly hunted. It was now clear that their watchtower would soon face the fiercest assault the orcs could muster. Theo's mother began to waver in their resolve. Against the might of the orc army, it seemed unlikely their watchtower could withstand even the first wave of attacks. Yet Arondir continued to rally their spirits. He declared that's precisely why they must fight bravely, and this is their one chance to redeem the mistakes of their ancestors. Fortunately, they weren't alone in this fight. In the far west, the most powerful human kingdom, Numenor, was already gathering its forces to march to Middle-earth and face the orc army in a decisive battle. While most citizens were focused on preparing supplies and weapons, dissenting voices arose among the ranks. One such voice belonged to Elendil's son. The son believed Numenor should not blindly follow the elves' command. His father, however, dismissed his objections as youthful inexperience. The father chided that he couldn't judge matters by their surface. There were immense hidden benefits here. If they help Halbrand, the rightful heir of the southern lands, reclaim his throne and defeat the orcs in the process, their king will owe them a tremendous debt. Then resources will flow into Numenor in abundance. When they're strong enough, even the elves will have no choice but to bow to them. Yet this grand vision was little more than wishful thinking. No one could have guessed that Halbrand, the future king of the southern lands, was toiling away in a blacksmith's forge at that very moment, sweat pouring from his brow. His greatest wish was not to reclaim his throne, but to earn a professional blacksmith's badge and establish a stable life in Numenor. Restoring his family's honor and liberating the southern people was merely a tale spun by Galadriel to persuade Numenor's regent queen to send troops. When Halbrand, Galadriel, and the queen finally met, the facade crumbled instantly. The regent queen, feeling deceived, turned on her heel and left. Halbrand, equally furious at being manipulated, threw down his family crest and stormed off, declaring if she wants to play games, do it herself. Galadriel was left stunned. The alliance she had painstakingly built was on the verge of collapse. To make matters worse, Elendil's son, fervently opposed to aiding the elves, came up with a reckless plan. Under the cover of night, he crept onto the warships, pried open the lids of the wine barrels, and set the wooden decks ablaze. 2 ships were completely destroyed in the ensuing fire. This catastrophe further dampened the Regent Queen's willingness to launch a campaign to Middle-earth. Even Captain Elendil suggested delaying the expedition, reasoning that with only 3 ships remaining, they stood no chance against the orcs. The Regent Queen added that unless Halbrand rallies the humans of the southern lands, they cannot proceed. But Halbrand had no intention of returning, leaving Galadriel determined not to give up. While passing through a street, Galadriel stumbled upon Captain Elendil training his soldiers. Watching their clumsy movements, she couldn't help but step in, explaining that defeating an orc doesn't require flashy techniques, and what matters are speed, precision, and ruthlessness. Elendil, feeling challenged, promised his soldiers that whoever can defeat Galadriel will be promoted to lieutenant. Energized by the incentive, the soldiers charged at Galadriel with fervor. What followed was less a sparring match and more a showcase of Galadriel's combat prowess. She moved with lightning speed through the crowd, cutting down her opponents with ease. Even Halbrand couldn't help but feel his diabetic blood stir. Galadriel wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. She knew that Halbrand had become the linchpin for the Human Alliance's military campaign, so she resumed her efforts to persuade him. The real reason Halbrand was reluctant to return to the southern lands of Middle-earth was his awareness of the deep-seated fear his people held toward the orcs. Worse, there was a chance they might betray him midway. Galadriel, seeing right through Halbrand's hesitation, confronted him if he ever planned to hide here like a coward for the rest of his life. Her words struck a nerve. Even if he stayed away, peace would continue to elude him. Galadriel reminded him that she had fought for centuries for this cause without success, and suggested that only by utterly defeating the orcs could true peace be achieved. Her argument hit home. In the end, Halbrand chose to join the Human Alliance's expedition, a decision that marked his growth. For the first time, he carried himself with the air of a king. As the soldiers gathered, the cheers of the townspeople echoed through the air. They boarded the remaining 3 warships, ready to embark. Galadriel was full of vigor, acting as the elven commander, for this army was set to become the main force against the orcs, alongside Halbrand, the human king of Middle-earth's southern lands. With a command from the captain, the majestic ships hoisted their sails and began their steady voyage south. A pivotal battle for humanity's fate was about to unfold. Meanwhile, far away in Middle-earth, the Harfoot clan seemed to sense the coming unrest. They had begun migrating as an entire tribe. The stranger had joined their journey. Over the days they spent together, he was moved by the Harfoot's optimistic and spirited nature, gradually becoming part of Nori's family. One day, as the group passed through a desolate forest, they were startled. The woods, once lush and green, had withered away. Someone blamed this ominous transformation on the stranger. Not far off, Nori discovered monstrous footprints and hurried to warn the group, but she was too late. 3 massive beasts suddenly emerged, sending the naturally timid Harfoots scattering in panic. At the critical moment, the stranger stepped forward. With a single burst of energy, he repelled the beasts, though the backlash injured his arm. His courageous act finally won the Harfoot's trust, solidifying his place among them. When Nori came to deliver medicine, she discovered the stranger healing himself in a strange manner, submerging his arm in water while chanting incantations. The water began to freeze. Curious, Nori placed her hand on the water but was instantly frozen in place. Startled, she frantically called for him to stop, yet the stranger remained unfazed until his healing process was complete. Only then was Nori released, flung backward by a sudden force. The recent dangers reignited her fears, causing her to worry if this enigmatic stranger would bring catastrophe to her people. Meanwhile, at the site where the stranger had initially fallen, 3 strangely dressed individuals arrived. The leader, a man holding a scepter and flanked by attendants carrying lighting equipment, exuded an imposing air. He examined the scorched ground, his expression turning ferocious. At the same time, the elven tribe could sense the looming turmoil in Middle-earth, as the life-giving aura of the sacred elven tree was being suffocated by an ominous, deathly energy, a sign that the light of the elves was fading. The High King of the Elves, wearing a somber expression, recited an ancient elven song, prompting Prince Elrond to recount its tale. According to legend, deep in the misty mountains, there once grew an ancient tree that housed the last remaining lost Silmaril of the elves. An elven warrior infused the tree with all the light of the elves in order to protect it from being destroyed by the hatred-fueled power of a Balrog, one of Morgoth's fearsome servants. The clash of opposing forces summoned a storm, and lightning struck the tree, channeling its energy into the mountain's roots. This event forged the resilient and lightweight Mithril. The High King added that the Mithril contained the fading light of the Silmaril. It turned out his long-winded explanation was meant to convince Elrond to obtain Mithril from the Dwarven Kingdom, which is essential for the elves' salvation. However, Elrond had sworn an oath never to reveal the secret of Mithril. Now he faced a harrowing dilemma. Should he break his vow, or watch as the elves perish with the fading light of the Silmaril? True to elven nature, he refused to make a direct choice. Instead, he presented the problem to Prince Durin of the Dwarves, explaining in vivid detail the intertwined fate of Mithril and the elven race. Durin, finally understanding Elrond's intentions, was moved by his honesty. With characteristic dwarven boldness, Durin readily agreed to share the Mithril. However, he reminded Elrond that the final decision rested with his father, the Dwarven King. Overjoyed, Elrond immediately set out with Durin for the Dwarven Kingdom. Previously, the orc leader J.R.R. rallied his forces with an impassioned speech before launching an attack on the elven watchtower. The orcs marched boldly toward their target, eager to tear their enemies apart. To everyone's surprise, however, they encountered no resistance. The gates of the watchtower swung open as if welcoming them home, but the place was completely deserted. J.R.R. ordered his troops to search the area. Not long after, his men reported back, saying there were no signs of anyone. Before they could finish their report, Arondir, the elven warrior hiding within the abandoned watchtower, suddenly stood and shot down 2 nearby orcs. He quickly fired another arrow, setting the latch on the watchtower's structure ablaze. The surrounding supports began to collapse rapidly, as if the heart of the tower had been ripped out. The orcs attempted to retreat, but Arondir was faster. He leapt from the tower, kicked a pre-positioned boulder into place, and sealed the main gate. Trapped like rats in a cage, the orcs watched as the tower's supports gave way. Within seconds, the entire structure came crashing down, burying them beneath the rubble. The villagers, who had relocated to an area near the settlement, cheered with excitement as they witnessed the spectacle. However, the village healer warned that the orc forces were far from annihilated and they needed to prepare for the next battle immediately. She argued the best location for their defense was their original village, and the entire community should be mobilized to build fortifications. Meanwhile, the human reinforcements from Numenor raced across the seas. By sunrise, they had sighted the coastline and were only hours away from the battlefield. Back in the village, the defensive preparations were complete. Arondir encouraged the villagers, assuring them that he had a plan to defeat the enemy. His words boosted morale, and the villagers were more determined than ever. Arondir knew that the orcs' attack had another purpose: to seize the broken sword. Despite his efforts, no method could destroy it, so he decided to hide it for the time being. As night fell, the villagers took up positions at the entrance of the village, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Before long, flickers of light pierced the shadows as a large orc force emerged. The inevitable had come. Casting aside any lingering hope for peace, the villagers steeled themselves for the battle ahead. This was a fight for survival, a battle for their very existence. The orcs advanced steadily toward the village, crossing the stone bridge with calculated precision. Once the entire force was on the bridge, the hidden villagers began executing their ambush plan. But something went wrong. The fire traps failed to ignite. Tension mounted as an orc scout with a torch approached their position. Realizing the situation was dire, the healer abandoned the failed trap and hid in the shadows. As the enemy drew close, she suddenly lunged, slashing the orc's throat with a sickle. Seizing the fallen torch, she lit a cart laden with firewood. The flames roared to life and surged toward the orcs, igniting the wooden traps laid in their path. Another flaming cart followed, engulfing the entire orc force in a blazing inferno. From the rooftops, Arondir was the first to attack, swiftly followed by the other archers. But the orcs broke through the wall of fire, charging toward the defenders on the rooftops. Just as it seemed the orcs might gain the upper hand, a large group of villagers emerged, shouting battle cries and charging into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The orcs were savage and relentless, but the human militia fought with desperation, knowing that losing this battle would mean the end of their homes and their way of life. Before long, a few stray orcs finally made it onto the rooftop, forcing Arondir to abandon his bow and engage in close combat. After dispatching several enemies, Arondir was visibly exhausted and in a moment of carelessness was pinned down by an orc. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a blade flew through the air, striking the orc dead. It was the village healer coming to the rescue. The two barely had time to exchange words and hormones before cheers erupted from the humans nearby. They had somehow defeated the orcs. Arondir glanced at the bodies around him, but quickly noticed something was off. The blood on the ground was red. Suspicious, he removed one of the helmets from the fallen orcs, revealing that many of the orcs were actually villagers who had betrayed their people and disguised themselves. One of the dying orcs let out a sinister laugh, mocking them for believing the traitors were anything more than expendable pawns. The mood turned grim. Before anyone could react, a volley of arrows rained down, striking several villagers. Even the healer was hit in the chaos. Arondir grabbed a wooden board to shield his muscles and carried the injured healer into the tavern. In the darkness, countless towering orc warriors emerged from the shadows. The real battle was about to begin. With most of the villagers injured or dead, the survivors were now cornered inside the small tavern. The healer, gravely wounded, needed immediate attention. Arondir, with the help of the healer's son, Theo, managed to extract the arrow and cauterize the wound, saving her life. But outside, the orc army had already surrounded the building. Fortunately, reinforcements from Numenor had landed and were racing toward the village at full speed. Whether they would arrive in time, however, remained uncertain. At that moment, the tavern doors were smashed open by the orcs. Now it was the villagers' turn to be trapped, with little hope of escape. The orcs quickly subdued them with ease. The only reason the villagers weren't slaughtered outright was because the orc leader Adar demanded the broken sword. Arondir refused to hand it over, but Adar wasted no time, ordering his forces to begin killing the villagers one by one. Soon, only the injured healer remained. As Arondir hesitated, Theo shouted that he knew where the sword was. It turned out Theo had seen Arondir hide the sword earlier and had been watching in secret. He used a rod to pry open a loose floor tile, revealing the sword hidden right under everyone's noses. Overjoyed, Adar retrieved the weapon and immediately turned to the traitorous barkeep, entrusting him with an important mission. At that moment, the ground began to quake violently as Numenorian cavalry arrived. Like a tidal wave, the mounted soldiers charged through the orc ranks, cutting them down in droves. Against the towering riders, the orcs completely lost their physical advantage and suffered devastating losses. The elven commander Galadriel led the charge with unparalleled grace, fighting so fiercely that it seemed she might take down the enemy barehanded. Captain Elendil fought valiantly but was pulled off his Ferrari horse by several orcs. Just as his life seemed to be over, a steel spear flew through the air, saving his shitty life in the nick of time. It was Halbrand who had come to his aid. Meanwhile, the human captives inside the tavern began to fight back, carving a bloody path to freedom. Arondir joined the battle, slicing his way through the orcs when he spotted Galadriel. He shouted to her, warning that Adar must not escape with the sword. Without hesitation, Galadriel leapt onto her horse and gave chase. Sensing something was wrong, Halbrand followed close behind. Galadriel's Ferrari horse galloped faster and faster, closing the distance between her and Adar. Just as she was about to catch him, Halbrand suddenly appeared ahead, cutting off Adar with a surprise attack. Caught off guard, Adar tumbled to the ground, disoriented and dazed. As Halbrand prepared to deliver the final blow, Galadriel stopped him, insisting that Adar must be kept alive. He still had a purpose to serve. When the two returned to the village, the battle had already ended. A large number of orcs had been taken prisoner, and Galadriel began interrogating Adar. With just one glance, she identified his origin. Adar was one of the elves abducted long ago by Morgoth, the Dark Lord, who twisted and corrupted them into his loyal servants. Adar was one of these unfortunate elves. However, Galadriel's primary concern was the whereabouts of the evil sorcerer Sauron. To her shock, Adar claimed that he had killed Sauron. Galadriel, unconvinced, dismissed the possibility. After all, no elf could be the supreme leader of the orcs. Adar, however, suddenly exuded an air of confidence and devotion, declaring that all these orcs were born of the master of secret fire and that he would soon take control of this land. Meanwhile, the villagers were oblivious to the looming catastrophe, celebrating their apparent victory with laughter and joy. The Queen Regent formally introduced Halbrand to the people, and through the family crest he bore, they all recognized him as their long-lost rightful king. Arondir approached Theo and handed him the reclaimed broken sword taken from Adar, suggesting that Theo hand it over to the Queen Regent and toss it into the sea on his way home, freeing himself from its sinister temptation. However, when Theo unwrapped the bundle, he discovered that the sword had been switched. The real broken sword was now in the hands of the traitorous barkeep. The barkeep, having stolen the sword, inserted its blade into the slot of the Watchtower Plaza and twisted it. The entire structure began to shake, and soon the dam holding back the Great Lake opened, releasing a massive flood. The villagers realized something was amiss as the wells began to rupture and overflow. Hearing the commotion, Adar was elated and knelt to listen carefully. It turned out the floodwaters had flowed through the tunnels they had previously excavated, reaching a massive volcano. When the scalding lava encountered the floodwaters, it triggered a violent eruption. In mere minutes, the enormous volcano exploded. As villagers stood frozen in shock, fiery volcanic rocks began to rain down from the sky. The villagers scattered in panic, but Galadriel stood motionless, her face filled with despair. She now understood that the true leader of the orcs, the master of secret fire, was about to rise. When the volcanic eruption subsided, the ground was blanketed in thick layers of ash. Galadriel surveyed the charred and desolate surroundings, her heart sinking into an icy void. She had no idea how to face the advancing orc armies. Desperately, she called out for King Halbrand of the Southlands and Númenórean commander Captain Elendil, but no response came. Eventually, she only found Theo, and the two decided to leave the devastated village for now. Fortunately, they weren't the only survivors of the volcanic catastrophe. The Queen Regent had already gathered a number of villagers and was working tirelessly to rescue any remaining survivors. The fires consuming the houses grew ever more intense, forcing everyone to keep moving without pause. Elendil's son and the Queen Regent were rescuing others in one of the houses when the roof suddenly collapsed. Meanwhile, Galadriel and Theo had made it to the edge of the forest, only to find orcs lurking ahead. Galadriel realized the area had become an orc stronghold. With volcanic ash blotting out the sun, the orcs could now roam freely during the day. Thankfully, the situation for the humans wasn't as dire as it seemed. Captain Elendil had gathered the remaining soldiers and was preparing to lead them through the forest to a previously established camp. However, his heart was heavy as he scanned the faces of everyone around him, unable to find his son. At that moment, the Queen Regent caught up with the main group, having narrowly escaped the collapsed house. Unfortunately, she brought grim news. Elendil's son had perished. The grieving father remained silent for a moment, then steadied himself, knowing his priority was to escort the Queen Regent and the remaining troops back to safety. Not long after, Captain Elendil received another devastating update. The Queen Regent had lost her eyesight. She had been concealing her blindness, pretending to be unaffected so as not to shake the morale of the soldiers. Now, Captain Elendil felt the burden on his shoulders grow even heavier. Thankfully, the group encountered no further orc attacks and arrived safely at the camp. Shortly thereafter, Galadriel and Theo also reached the camp. The first thing Theo did upon arrival was search for his mother. Seeing the scattered corpses along the way filled him with dread, fearing that one of them might belong to her. To his immense relief, Theo found his mother alive and well in the medical tent, accompanied by Arondir. Under the healer's guidance, Galadriel climbed the hill to meet with the Queen Regent. Noticing the bandage over her eyes, Galadriel expressed regret, apologizing for dragging her into this war and causing such immense losses. Yet the Queen Regent, undeterred, declared her intention to return to Numenor to summon reinforcements, vowing not to let the orcs live another day. Galadriel could only bow in respect. After bidding farewell to the Queen Regent, the healer informed Galadriel of her plans to lead the villagers to Pelargir, where fresh water and fertile lands awaited them. Galadriel, however, decided to return to the Elven realm to request reinforcements from the High King to fight the orcs. Before leaving, the healer urged Galadriel to visit one person in particular, King Halbrand of the Southlands, who had been bedridden after collapsing the previous night. Halbrand had narrowly escaped death and was brought back to camp by chance. Examining his festering wounds, Galadriel determined that only elven medicine could save him. Without hesitation, she and Halbrand mounted their horses and departed the camp, heading swiftly toward the elven lands. Elsewhere, the Harfoots had been trekking for weeks and were nearing a way station, where they hoped to replenish their supplies. But upon arrival, they were horrified by what they saw. The orchards and greenery had been reduced to ashes, and what little food remained was barely enough to sustain them. The tribe's sage speculated that the southern volcano's eruption was to blame. Now, the Harfoots faced their greatest challenge: how to survive with so little. As they pondered their plight, they noticed the stranger standing not far ahead. The sage, remembering how the man had used his powers to drive away a pack of wolves, quickly formed an idea. Perhaps this person could revive the scorched trees. Under the hopeful gazes of the Harfoots, the stranger began to chant an incantation. Before long, the blackened bark on the fruit trees began to peel away, and excitement lit up the faces of the Harfoots. They thought the spell had worked. However, the next moment, a large branch broke off, nearly crushing some of the nearby villagers. Disappointment and fear spread among the Harfoots as they looked toward the stranger. Not only had his spell failed, but it had almost caused a disaster. Overwhelmed with guilt, the stranger sank into self-reproach, aware that this was not the first time he had brought trouble to the Harfoots. Sensing it was time for him to leave, the sage handed the stranger a chart depicting the constellation he had been searching for. The sage explained that it was drawn by their ancestors in human lands and suggested that the figure seek answers there. As he prepared to depart, the Harfoots gathered around him to bid him farewell, torn between hope and sadness. Only Nori offered him a small handful of apples as a final gift of parting. None of them noticed, however, that the once barren tree touched by the stranger's spell had begun to sprout fresh green buds. By the next morning, Nori woke to a wonderful surprise. The scorched fruit trees and surrounding plants had miraculously come back to life. The Harfoots were overjoyed, eagerly picking fruit and storing it in their mobile shelters. It was now clear that the stranger had indeed succeeded in his efforts, though sadly the Harfoots had misunderstood him. Later that day, as Nori's friend was drawing water by the river, they spotted a giant footprint nearby. That evening, they kept watch, and sure enough, 3 women dressed in white appeared near the site where the stranger had cast his spell. The women sniffed the air and pointed in the direction of human lands. Realizing they were tracking the stranger, Nori rushed out to stop them, claiming that the man had gone in a different direction. The childish lie instantly angered the white-clad women. Nori's father, alarmed, grabbed a torch to protect his child, but one of the women casually extinguished the flames with a wave of her hand. She then blew across her palm, and the supplies the Harfoots had painstakingly gathered during the day erupted into flames. The Harfoots fell to their knees, wailing in despair as their belongings were reduced to ashes. By the next morning, the Harfoots' provisions were completely destroyed. Yet their resilient nature shone through. They resolved to start over, determined as ever. Nori's father encouraged them, saying that while the Harfoots lacked physical strength and magical powers, their unwavering determination and loyalty to one another had allowed them to endure. Inspired by his words, Nori decided to travel to human lands ahead of the white-clad women to warn the stranger. Many in the group supported her decision, including her mother and her best friend, who offered to accompany her. Even the tribe's sage declared they would join this perilous journey. The scene shifts to the Dwarven Kingdom, where the elven prince Elrond is negotiating a deal with the Dwarven king. Elrond hopes the king will provide enough mithril to sustain the survival of the elves. In return, the elves would supply the dwarves with food, timber, and other resources for 5 consecutive years. Many lords present were tempted by the proposal, but the Dwarven king remained unmoved. He dismissed everyone except his son Durin, and then solemnly explained that their ancestors had left a warning. Mining the mithril veins in the mountains was extremely dangerous. He refused to risk dwarven lives to help the elves escape death. Durin was furious after hearing this. He couldn't stand by and watch his best friend suffer over a mere possibility of danger. However, the king stubbornly adhered to the ancestral warning, refusing to relent. When Durin's wife learned of this, she furiously berated the king, calling him a stubborn and selfish old fool. Durin, however, remained calm, understanding that his father had the final say as a king and that no one should disobey his decision. In the end, Durin was forced to relay the bad news to his friend Elrond. Although Elrond was filled with disappointment, he managed to force a smile and said he needed to return to inform the High King of the results. Before leaving, Elrond returned the piece of mithril that Durin had given him as a token of friendship. It seemed this might be their last meeting. Tears welled up in Durin's eyes as he angrily hurled the mithril onto a nearby table. Then, something miraculous happened. The piece of mithril landed near a branch of the elven tree, which had been tainted with deathly energy, and its leaves slowly began to revive. Durin and his wife were stunned, realizing that Elrond's claims had been true all along. With this revelation, Durin decided to secretly mine the mithril veins to prove to everyone that it wasn't as dangerous as they feared and to compel the king to change his mind. This time, as his pickaxe struck the rock, the wall of the mine gave way, revealing a massive cavern filled with an expansive vein of mithril. Just then, the king arrived with his guards. Durin eagerly tried to show his father the mine, but the king dismissed it, caring little for what had been discovered. Instead, he was furious that Durin had defied his orders. He ordered Elrond to be expelled from the dwarven kingdom, effectively ending his mission in failure. Worse, Durin was also punished. His father ripped the family crest from his chest and decreed that the mithril mine be sealed permanently. As the king walked out of the mine, he casually tossed a branch from the elven tree into its depths. To everyone's shock, the branch burst into flames upon hitting the ground, and the familiar energy of the elves awakened a long-dormant Balrog from its slumber. The scene shifts to the stranger leaving the Harfoots and passing through the greenwood. He thought about his Harfoot friend Nori. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of a small figure darting through the trees, looking a lot like a Harfoot. Out of curiosity, he followed it to an open clearing, only to discover that the figure was actually the trio of white-clad individuals who had been tracking him. Shocked, the man instinctively backed away, sensing that they were not to be trusted. To his surprise, the three white-clad figures suddenly knelt before him and repeatedly addressed him as Lord Sauron. After a long hesitation, the stranger reluctantly accepted this identity. The white-clad figures explained that he had suffered a devastating defeat in a great battle, during which the enemy set a spell upon his mind, causing him to lose his memory and seal away his powers. Though his abilities were slowly returning on their own, the process was far too slow. That's why they had come to escort him back to Rhûn, where the constellation he had been searching for could be found and where his full power as Sauron would awaken. With his power restored, he would be able to dominate all living beings on the land. Overwhelmed with excitement, the man's energy flared uncontrollably once more. The white-clad leader quickly subdued him with a breath, rendering him unconscious. Unbeknownst to them, Nori and her companions had arrived just in time to witness the scene. Mistakenly believing that the stranger had been captured, they used the opportunity while the white-clad figures were distracted to sneak closer in an attempt to rescue him. However, their efforts were laughably futile in the eyes of the white-clad figures, and they were quickly captured. Just as all seemed lost, the man suddenly unleashed a surge of energy, sending all three white-clad figures flying like Barbie toys. The leader of the white-clad trio, however, was not so easily defeated. Using her staff, she managed to knock the man unconscious once again. But this delay gave Nori and her friends enough time to escape into the forest, disappearing from sight. Enraged, the white-clad leader cast a fire spell, igniting the surrounding trees in an attempt to flush them out. Within moments, the fire had spread across dozens of meters, engulfing the forest in flames. Yet instead of fleeing, Nori picked up the leader's staff and approached the stranger, pleading for his help to save her friends. The man, now fully aware of his identity as the evil sorcerer, urged Nori to leave him, fearing he might bring even greater harm. But Nori firmly believed that no one is born evil. It is their actions that determine whether they were good or bad. Hearing her words, the man seemed to awaken from his despair. Slowly, he took the staff from Nori, and just as her companions were cornered by the flames and prepared for the worst, the fire around them suddenly extinguished. The man had finally acted. Turning to face the white-clad figures, he commanded them to return to the shadows. It was then that the trio realized the man was not Sauron, but one of the wizards, powerful beings sent to Middle-earth by the Valar god. Before they could react, the man raised the staff, unleashing a surge of radiant power. The white-clad figures disintegrated into glowing moths and vanished into the air. The Harfoots, shaken but alive, embraced each other in relief, thankful to have survived. Although they lacked the strength to fight directly, they had managed to help the stranger in their own way. Unfortunately, the Harfoot sage was gravely injured during the ordeal, and as the warm sunlight broke through the forest canopy, he peacefully passed away. The experience seemed to fully restore the stranger's mind. Although he still didn't understand what the white-clad figures meant by calling him a wizard, he decided to travel to Rhûn to uncover the truth. Upon hearing this, Nori decided to accompany the stranger on his journey to Rhûn. Meanwhile, in the Elven city, Elrond had informed the master craftsman of the dwarves' refusal to provide mithril. Both men were deeply disheartened, helplessly watching as the elven tree continued to wither. The master craftsman held the lone piece of mithril in his hand, wondering if there was a way to amplify its properties infinitely. At that moment, Galadriel arrived at the city with the injured Halbrand. The elves' advanced healing techniques were indeed unparalleled. Within a single night, Halbrand's injuries were almost completely healed. While stretching and moving around, Halbrand accidentally wandered into the master craftsman's workshop, where he noticed 3 gems resting on the table. These were none other than the legendary Silmarils, infused with the sacred light of Valinor. His attention was then drawn to the piece of mithril, and he quickly recognized its extraordinary nature. He mentioned that during his time in the human kingdoms, he often combined rare metals to create alloys of significantly superior quality. The master craftsman was inspired by Halbrand's explanation and proposed to the High King the idea of crafting a crown using mithril through fusion techniques. He explained that because light could refract infinitely within a closed circular loop, such a crown would be imbued with limitless power, ensuring the eternal survival of the elven tree. However, the High King was unwilling to wait any longer. Since the eruption of the volcano in the Southlands, the tree's branches had been shedding rapidly, and he insisted that they must evacuate Middle-earth as soon as possible. The master craftsman pleaded for more time, arguing that the crown's power would not be physical but spiritual, capable of sustaining life. Galadriel found the statement eerily familiar. Upon inquiry, she learned that the master craftsman had heard it from Halbrand. On the other hand, Elrond caught up with the High King and reminded him of a significant debt he owed. Reluctantly, the High King agreed to delay the evacuation for 3 months to allow the master craftsman time to craft the mithril crown. Unfortunately, the timeline was far too short, making success almost impossible. Thankfully, Halbrand, skilled in metallurgy, provided several invaluable suggestions during the process. However, Galadriel grew uneasy. The phrase, "power to sustain life," echoed in her mind. It was none other than the motto of the evil sorcerer Sauron. Suspicious, she secretly ordered her men to investigate the royal bloodline records of the Southlands. The intelligence came back swiftly, and as Galadriel read through the documents, her face turned pale. The records revealed that the Southlands' royal bloodline had been extinct for over 1,000 years, and Halbrand's claim of being a royal heir was a complete fabrication. When confronted, Halbrand's demeanor darkened and he admitted the truth. The royal crest he carried was merely something he had picked up, and his true identity was none other than the sorcerer Sauron himself. Outraged, Galadriel drew her dagger, but the next thing she knew, she was standing in the outskirts of the elven city. To her shock, her long-dead brother appeared before her, urging her to let go of her obsession with hunting down Sauron. He insisted that Sauron's goals aligned with those of the elves, ensuring peace in Middle-earth. Galadriel realized the figure before her wasn't her brother at all, but an illusion conjured by Sauron. The scene shifts back to the boat where Galadriel and Halbrand first met. Halbrand continued to whisper his temptations, saying she gave him light to banish darkness, and he would grant her power to lead the elves. Together their union can rule Middle-earth. However, Galadriel sought salvation, not domination. She clenched her dagger and thrust it into him with all her might. The next moment, Galadriel found herself submerged in water, unable to breathe as the suffocating sensation overwhelmed her. Suddenly, she heard Elrond's voice and was pulled out of the water by him. Upon learning that the mithril rings were nearing completion, Galadriel rushed to the workshop. Fortunately, she arrived just in time. The rings weren't finished yet, and Halbrand had disappeared. Relieved, she cautioned everyone not to have any further contact with Halbrand. She then proposed forging 3 rings instead of 1, as this would create a more balanced power. The master craftsman agreed, but pointed out a critical requirement. The mithril must be fused with the purest gold and silver. Galadriel's dagger from Valinor, a keepsake from her brother, was the perfect candidate. For the sake of her people, she threw her brother's only memento into the molten furnace. Meanwhile, Elrond added the mithril gifted to him by the dwarves. The 2 metals quickly fused together. After cooling, the ring molds were completed. Skilled artisans polished and set the rings with great care, and at last, the legendary 3 elven rings were forged. At the same time, Halbrand, revealed as Dark Lord Sauron, seemed to sense the birth of the elven rings, smiling as he gazed at the distant volcano. When the Queen Regent returned to Númenor, she discovered countless ships anchored at the port. Compared to the mere 3 ships that had been dispatched previously, the fleet's scale had grown significantly. This urgent shipbuilding effort was due to the old king's final act before his death. As if foreseeing the future, he used his last breath to warn his people that an alliance with the elves must be restored, or Númenor would face annihilation. While the kingdom's strength had increased, it also foreshadowed that the next great war in Middle-earth would be even more devastating. With that, Season 1 of this drama concludes.